Nanking Massacre. On December 13, 1937, 2 years before Hitler invaded Poland, in what many historians see as the true beginning of World War II in Asia, Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanking after weeks of fighting. What followed became one of the most brutal atrocities of the Second World War. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers murdered at least 100,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers. Most estimates put the toll between 200,000 and 300,000. The killing took many forms. Mass executions were carried out along the Yangtze River, where thousands were lined up, machine-gunned, and their bodies dumped into the water. Soldiers went house to house, dragging out men for execution. Chinese prisoners of war were marched to designated killing grounds, tied together, and shot. Historians agree that sexual violence was widespread during the massacre, with countless women and girls assaulted and many not surviving the attacks. John Rabe, a German businessman who stayed in Nanking, established a safety zone that sheltered about 200,000 civilians. He and other foreigners documented the atrocities in diaries and photographs, smuggling evidence out of the city. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, protected thousands of women at Ginling College, though soldiers still broke in repeatedly to drag women away. The Japanese military covered up the massacre initially, and when reports reached the outside world, they were dismissed as propaganda. After the war, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East held trials in Tokyo. Commander Iwan Matsui was convicted of failing to prevent the atrocities and was executed in 1948. Lieutenant General Hisao Tani was executed by Chinese authorities in 1947 for his direct role in mass killings. Yet many perpetrators were never prosecuted. The massacre remains controversial today, with some Japanese officials and textbooks downplaying or denying its extent, causing ongoing diplomatic tensions with China. Unit 731. Between 1936 and 1945, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a secret biological and chemical warfare research program in Manchuria known as Unit 731. Under the command of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, the unit conducted grotesque experiments on living human subjects, mostly Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others deemed enemies of the state. At least 10,000 people were killed in the experiments themselves, and some researchers argue that tens of thousands more died in field tests across China. The facility, located near Harbin in northeast China, was disguised as a water purification unit. Inside, prisoners were infected with diseases like plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid to study the progression of infection without treatment. Subjects were dissected while still alive and conscious to observe the effects on living tissue. Frostbite experiments involved freezing limbs and then testing different methods of thawing them. Reports from former staff and post-war testimonies describe that some prisoners had limbs amputated and reattached to different parts of their bodies. Others were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out or were spun in centrifuges until death. Flamethrowers and grenades were tested on live prisoners tied to stakes. The unit also conducted field tests, releasing plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands. Water supplies were poisoned with cholera and typhoid. Contaminated food was distributed to villages. Prisoners were referred to as logs, dehumanizing them completely. Guards were told that the subjects were not human, which made the torture easier to carry out. As the war ended in August 1945, Unit 731 destroyed most of the evidence. Buildings were blown up, remaining prisoners were killed, and documents were burned. The staff fled back to Japan. After the war, the United States granted immunity to Ishii and his top researchers in exchange for their data on biological warfare. This information was considered too valuable to lose, even though it had been obtained through mass murder. No one from Unit 731 was prosecuted by the Americans. Some members were later tried by the Soviet Union in the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949, where 12 were convicted and received prison sentences. Ishii himself lived freely in Japan until his death in 1959. Bataan Death March. On April 9, 1942, after months of fighting on the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, approximately 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers surrendered to Japanese forces. It was the largest surrender in American military history. What followed was a forced march that became one of the most notorious atrocities of the Pacific War. The prisoners, already weakened by months of combat, disease, and starvation, were forced to march over 60 miles in tropical heat to prison camps. Japanese guards showed no mercy. Anyone who fell behind, asked for water, or tried to help others was beaten, bayoneted, or shot. Prisoners were packed so tightly together that some suffocated. They were denied food and water for days. When they reached artesian wells along the route, guards often refused to let them drink or shot those who tried. Some prisoners were forced to sit in the sun for hours without shade. Others were buried alive. Dysentery, malaria, and beriberi killed many during the march itself. Bodies lined the roads. Some estimates suggest that between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino soldiers died, along with 500 to 650 Americans. Those who survived the march reached Camp O'Donnell, where conditions were equally horrific. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and disease killed thousands more in the following months. At Camp O'Donnell alone, approximately 1,500 Americans and 26,000 Filipinos died within weeks of arrival. The death march became widely known after the war through survivor testimonies. General Masaharu Hama, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines, was tried by an American military tribunal in Manila in 1946. He was found guilty of war crimes for failing to control his troops and prevent the atrocities. Hama was executed by firing squad on April 3, 1946. Other officers involved in the march were also tried and executed. And recognition. Manila Massacre. In February 1945, as American forces closed in on Manila to liberate the city from Japanese occupation, Japanese troops trapped inside began a systematic campaign of killings, brutality, and destruction that lasted nearly a month. The Manila Massacre claimed the lives of an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians, making it one of the worst urban atrocities of World War II. Japanese forces, knowing they were defeated, turned their rage on the civilian population. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi ordered his naval troops to defend Manila to the death rather than retreat as ordered by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. As the battle intensified, Japanese soldiers went neighborhood by neighborhood, killing entire families. At the Red Cross building, soldiers killed doctors, nurses, and patients. At the German club, they locked refugees inside and set the building on fire, burning hundreds alive. Those who tried to escape were machine-gunned. At the Bayview Hotel, Japanese troops imprisoned and repeatedly assaulted hundreds of women and girls. At Paco Church, soldiers killed priests and civilians sheltering inside, then 46. The trial was controversial, with critics arguing that a commander should not be held responsible for subordinates acting against orders. Oradour sur Glane. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, men from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, surrounded the quiet French village of Oradour sur Glane in central France. The unit had been ordered north to help repel the Allied invasion, but was frustrated by resistance attacks along the way. They decided to make an example of the village. At around 2 p.m., SS troops sealed off all roads and ordered every resident to gather in the village square for an identity check. The soldiers claimed they were searching for hidden weapons and resistance fighters. The men were separated from the women and children, who were locked inside the church. The men were divided into groups and taken to barns and other buildings around the village. There, machine guns had been set up. Without warning, soldiers opened fire on their legs, aiming to wound rather than kill outright. Then they piled straw and wood on the wounded men and set them on fire, burning them alive. Those who tried to escape were shot. In the church, the women and children heard the gunfire and began to panic. Soldiers then carried in an incendiary device, possibly a smoke bomb or explosive, and detonated it. The church filled with thick black smoke and flames. As women and children tried to flee through the doors and windows, soldiers fired on them. Inside, mothers suffocated or burned to death with their children. One woman, Marguerite Rufanche, survived by jumping out of a window behind the altar, though she was shot and wounded. Out of 642 people in Oradour that day, 190 men, 247 women, and many were released within years. Babin Yar. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, in a ravine called Babin Yar on the outskirts of Kyiv, German forces carried out one of the largest single massacres of Jews during the Holocaust. In just 2 days, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were shot and killed. The massacre was organized by SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich Jeckeln and carried out by members of Einsatzgruppe C, along with German Order Police, Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, and Wehrmacht units. Following the German occupation of Kyiv, officials posted notices ordering all Jews to assemble on September 29th, claiming they would be resettled. Tens of thousands arrived, believing they were being evacuated. Instead, they were forced to walk toward Babin Yar. As they approached the ravine, they were ordered to hand over valuables and remove their clothing. Groups were then marched to the edge of the ravine, forced to lie face down on top of the bodies already there, and shot in the back of the head. Layer after layer of bodies filled the ravine. Witnesses described the earth moving for days afterward as victims who had been buried alive tried to claw their way out. The shootings continued in smaller numbers over the following months. Jews who had been in hiding, Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists, and psychiatric patients were brought to Babin Yar and killed. By the time the Nazis retreated in 1943, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 people had been murdered there. Before leaving, the Germans tried to destroy the evidence. In August 1943, they forced prisoners to dig up the bodies, burn them on makeshift pyres, crush the bones, and scatter the ashes. This operation lasted weeks, and those who participated were then shot to prevent them from testifying. After the war, the Soviet Union suppressed the Jewish identity of the victims, instead referring to them only as Soviet citizens. no memorial was erected for decades, and the site was neglected. It was not until 1976 that a monument was placed at Babin Yar, and even then, it made no mention of Jews. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union did Ukraine begin to properly commemorate the massacre. Several perpetrators were tried after the war. Paul Blobel, the officer who organized the burning of bodies, was executed in 1951. Others received prison sentences, but many escaped justice entirely. Dresden bombing. On the night of February 13, 1945, the British Royal Air Force launched the first of several massive bombing raids on the German city of Dresden. Over 2 days, British and American bombers dropped nearly 4,000 tons of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries on the city, creating a firestorm that consumed much of the historic center. The death toll has been debated for decades, but modern estimates suggest around 25,000 people were killed. The bombing of Dresden remains one of the most controversial Allied operations of the war. Dresden, located in eastern Germany, had relatively limited heavy armaments industry, but was a major transportation and administrative hub, and by early 1945, it was filled with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. By February 1945, the city's population had swelled from around 640,000 to over 1 million. On the night of February 13th, over 700 British Lancaster bombers attacked the city in 2 waves. The first wave dropped high explosive bombs to blow out windows and expose building interiors. The second wave dropped incendiaries that ignited the exposed structures. The combination created a firestorm, a phenomenon where fires generate such intense heat that they create their own winds, sucking oxygen from surrounding areas and reaching temperatures over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. People in bomb shelters suffocated as the fires consumed all available oxygen. Those who emerged into the streets were caught in winds strong enough to pull them into the flames. The heat was so intense that bodies were reduced to ash, and survivors described seeing people turned into human torches running through the streets. The next day, American bombers arrived to continue the legitimate military action continues. Tokyo firebombing. On the night of March 9, 1945, 334 American B-29 bombers flew low over Tokyo and dropped nearly 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. The attack created a firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, making it the deadliest air raid in history. The bombing was ordered by Major General Curtis LeMay, who had grown frustrated with the limited effectiveness of high-altitude precision bombing against Japanese industrial targets. He decided to switch tactics, targeting entire urban areas with incendiaries designed to ignite the wooden structures that made up most of Tokyo's residential neighborhoods. The bombers flew at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, to avoid Japanese fighter planes and improve accuracy. They dropped M69 incendiary cluster bombs that scattered smaller bomblets filled with napalm. The bombs ignited on impact, spreading fires that quickly merged into a massive inferno. The fires generated winds of over 100 miles per hour, creating a firestorm similar to Dresden. Temperatures reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and metal. Canals boiled. People leapt into water tanks to escape the heat, only to be boiled alive. Others suffocated as the fires consumed all oxygen. Thousands were trampled in the panicked evacuation. Survivors described the air itself catching fire and people being turned into human torches. The firestorm burned for hours, destroying over 16 square miles of the city. An estimated 1 million people were left homeless. In the months that followed, American bombers carried out similar raids on dozens of other Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands more civilians. The strategy was to break Japanese morale and force a surrender without the need for a ground invasion. After the war, the firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities was not prosecuted as a war crime. LeMay himself later admitted, "If we had lost the war, we would have been prosecuted as war criminals." The bombing is remembered differently in the United States and Japan. In America, it is often justified as a necessary step to end the war and save lives that would have been lost in an invasion. In Japan, it is commemorated as a tragedy that killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians. A memorial hall in Tokyo honors the victims, and the bombing remains a painful chapter in Japan.